That you were the one responsible for our defeat at Malachor 5.
The General told you that?
We fell into your trap at Malachor and we paid the price. We were eager to destroy the Republic fleet and defeat Revan, so we committed all of our forces to Malachor, sealing our doom. Even then, we might have won the day. The tide of battle was turning when the Republic finally set off their trap. We were almost completely destroyed. You should be proud.
I destroyed your people.
It is as much your triumph as our failure. We learned a lesson and we paid the price for our mistake. I hold no grudge against you for what you did. It is the Mandalorian way to respect strength, and we will not be so foolish ever again.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaylee and I am the gaming anthropologist. Thank you for joining me on my journey into the ethnography of Mandalorian history and culture. So, episode 2, Origins and Mythic History. There are cultures whose origins are recorded in archives, and there are cultures whose beginnings live in the realm of myth. Mandalorians belong firmly to the second category. Their earliest stories are not historical documents, but cultural touchstones, shaped and reshaped across centuries of war, diaspora, and reinvention. To understand Mandalorians as people, one must begin not with dates or battles, but with the stories they tell about themselves. Stories that explain who they are, who they were, and who they believe they ought to be. The oldest of these stories centers on a figure known as Mandalore the First. Little about him is fixed. He exists in the hazy space where legend and identity intertwine. In some tellings, he is a conqueror who led the Taung, an ancient humanoid species, from the shadows of galactic prehistory into the harsh world that would become Mandalore. In others, he is a culture hero, a founder whose name became the title for every leader who followed. What matters is not the accuracy of the tale, but the function that it serves. Mandalore the First is the symbolic ancestor of an entire people, the mythic root from which Mandalorian identity grows. Dave Filoni once remarked that myth is essential to understanding Mandalorians because they are not a race, they are a culture. That distinction is crucial. The earliest Mandalorians were the Taung, but over time the identity expanded, absorbing humans, Zabrak, Twi'lek, and countless others. The shift from species to culture is not a historical footnote. It is the foundation of Mandalorian identity. Anyone could become a Mandalorian if they embraced the way, fought under the banner of a clan, or pledged themselves to the Mandalore. Myth made this possible. Myth allowed Mandalorians to imagine themselves as a single people, even as their bloodlines diverged. The Mandalorian Crusades, a series of expansionist wars that scarred the early galaxy, are remembered with a mixture of pride and regret. In Legends continuity, these crusades were led by Mandalore the Indomitable and Mandalore the Ultimate, figures whose names alone reveal how mythic memory shapes political identity. These leaders are remembered not as administrators or diplomats, but as embodiments of a warrior ideal. Their deeds, real or imagined, became the stories Mandalorians told around fires, in training halls, and later in exile. Even in canon where the details differ, the cultural logic remains the same. The Crusades are the crucible in which Mandalorian identity was forged. Filoni has spoken about this dynamic in interviews, explaining that Mandalorians are always fighting each other, and that this internal conflict is part of their tragedy. But it is also part of their mythology. The Crusades are not simply wars against outsiders. They are wars that define insiders. They are the stories Mandalorians use to explain why strength matters, why unity is fragile, and why leadership is always contested. Myth becomes a stabilizing force precisely because history is unstable. In the Clone Wars, when Filoni and George Lucas reintroduced Mandalorians to a new generation, they leaned into this tension between myth and reality. Lucas had long imagined Mandalorians as super commandos, a term he used during development conversations, but he also approved the idea of new Mandalorians, a pacifist movement that rejected the warrior past. This is not a contradiction. It was an acknowledgement that cultures evolve, fracture, and reinterpret their own stories. The pacifists were not an erasure of Mandalorian myth, but a reaction to it, a reminder that myth can be both a guide and a burden. The tension between mythic past and lived present appears again in Rebels, when Sabine Wren discovers the Darksaber. Filoni describes the weapon as a symbol of leadership and history, and in that moment, Sabine is not simply holding a blade. She is holding the weight of Mandalorian memory. The Darksaber is a myth made tangible, a story you can ignite with a switch. When Sabine hesitates before training with it, the hesitation is cultural, not personal. She is confronting the stories her people tell about themselves and deciding whether she belongs with them. Real-world cultures often use myth in similar ways. Diasporic communities preserve stories of origin to maintain identity across distance and time. Warrior societies construct heroic ancestors to justify codes of honor. Nations invent founding figures to unify diverse populations. Mandalorians, though fictional, follow these same anthropological patterns. Their myths are not decorative, they are functional. They explain why a people without a planet still call themselves a people. In The Mandalorian, Jon Favreau continues this tradition by framing Din Djarin's identity through mythic language. The armorer speaks of the songs of eons past, invoking a lineage that stretches beyond any single clan or creed. Din's own origin, a foundling rescued during the Clone Wars, is not presented as a historical detail, but as a mythic moment, a rebirth into culture defined by story as much as blood. Favreau has said that the show is about a people scattered across the galaxy trying to hold on to their identity, and myth is the thread that binds them.
That's what we want.
When it comes to the Mandalorian lore, are you guys drawing from any elements of the old expanded universe?
It's somewhat ambiguous. I think we mentioned things. I think we draw from more than just within Star Wars because they're a warrior culture. Right. Mm-hmm. And so the way is, the way of the warrior is Bushido. It's shared by a lot of different cultures. The Stoics. There's, we wanted to differentiate it from the definitely Eastern-leaning version of the Force, of teaching of the Jedi, and to create something that felt a little bit more rooted in the foundations of a warrior culture. So samurai, and Romans, and even the Greeks. So it's you see that there's different combinations of more of a Western civilization's spiritual underpinnings. So, but all of this is, in following in George's footsteps of, he looked at, like Joseph Campbell, what are the commonalities of all religions? And so the differentiation is just enough to differentiate it from the Jedi to the Mandalorians because they were historically enemies. But we do draw from a lot of things, and the, again, the myth, the study of myth and story within cultures all points to certain commonalities, and we try to draw from those same inspirations as George did.
Look.
Origins for Mandalorians are not about where they came from, but about what they choose to remember. Mandalore the First may never have existed in a literal sense, but he exists in every Mandalorian who invokes his name. The Crusades may be half legend, half history, but they shape the ethos of every warrior who dons a helmet. Myth is the architecture of Mandalorian identity, the scaffolding that holds together a culture defined by fragmentation, reinvention, and survival. To study Mandalorian origins is to study the stories that endure. Stories of founders, conquerors, exiles, and rebels. Stories that explain why a people have lost their homeworld more than once, still speak of themselves as a nation. Stories that transform history into meaning and meaning into identity. In the end, Mandalorian myth is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what matters. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through Mandalorian ethnography. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. I'll see you in 2 weeks. This is the way.
This is the way.